Hey, everybody. Welcome to a special episode of the podcast.
Very special.
This episode is called When You Don't Know What You're Talking About, Call an Expert.
AKA one of your wives.
So this is fun. Connie, you and I have done stuff before. This is Connie, and she is a pastor and currently researching in the area of trauma and the intersection of trauma and theology. But do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Connie Vissers. I am an ordained minister, but I'm researching at the intersection of trauma, children's spirituality, and resilience. So I'm looking specifically at promotive factors for resilience and whether Christian spirituality for kids and which practices therein might promote resilience in the face of trauma.
Wow.
Are you hearing this for the first time?
I am, in those words. And that's just like, wow, I love it. I mean, it's putting, you know, it's one of those like rubber hits the road type of conversations that we talk about how our faith can carry us through, but sometimes often it is in a very lip service way, not in a, and here's the guts behind it. Here's the reasoning behind it. Here's the research. Here's the scripture. Here's all of this beyond just the hallmark. Don't worry, God will see you through, right? Like our faith sustains us, and yes, and how? So that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm glad you're doing that.
Like, I think one of the things that Alex, you and I have tried to do with this podcast is land it in pretty practical places. And that's what we're hoping to do with this conversation specifically, for Connie to give us some really practical next steps following our conversation.
Yeah.
But maybe just as a way in, we should fill everybody in on what happened in the world that not many people are talking about right now.
Recently or larger, micro or macro?
Sort of micro-ish.
Yes.
In the grand scheme of things, something that, you know, I think gives us a window into maybe most of our hearts and minds and souls and psyches right now, but also in the grand scheme of things, like not all that important. So, you know, we've been talking about this and decided it would be just a fun one-off conversation about trauma and resilience. Because as we've been talking and as we've been unpacking what happened at the Oscars with Will Smith slapping Chris Rock, who was hosting because of a joke that Chris Rock made
insensitive.
One of the things that we got talking about was just the reality that we're experiencing in our own sort of local areas, that people are reacting now in ways that maybe would have surprised them a few years ago.
Right.
And so reactions, good and bad, seem to be enlarged, seem to be really sort of like blown out of proportion. And I do mean like the good and the bad, the happy and the sad, the angry, the rejoicing. Like emotion in general right now is all just kind of heightened. And rather than you and I talk about it, we thought it'd be great to have Connie come and talk about it a little bit from like a trauma perspective.
Can you maybe start by kind of painting for us a picture of, like, are we onto something here, or is this just entirely like, it's nice, guys? Is there a fallout that happens, good or bad? Is there an extreme that people reach when things change to that degree? Because I think as things open up is what we're talking about, right? After the last 2 years, as things open up,
So I think long before the opening process, there's been multisystemic trauma happening throughout the world for the past 2.5 years with the pandemic. There is research around pandemics specifically and looking at mass trauma in terms of pandemics throughout history. And very interesting research by a guy out of UBC who talks about the last 7 pandemics, which many people don't even know that there were that many between now and about 1850. You hear about them every 100 years or so, but there's smaller ones, micro pandemics that exist as well. And the same features can be tracked in old newspaper clippings, in like journals from decades ago.
John Wilkes Booth actually slapped Abe Lincoln first. And sorry, that's the type of stuff that gets edited out.
That's the type of Wouldn't it have been funny if you had asked, "Are we onto something?" and she just said no? Like, well,
not at all.
We didn't think about it at least even that far. We're like, let's talk about it.
Maybe we should test our thesis, even just the tiniest bit, before we hit play.
No.
Why would we do that?
So, like, Connie, is it fair to even call the last 2 years that we've all sort of collectively experienced trauma? Because the way I see it, like, I think, you know, I had this analogy that Alex and I talked about, and then I told you, and you kind of like half said, yes, it's good, and half laughed at it. But like, you know, I picture I never want to make light of individual extreme acts of violence that cause trauma person to person, right? And so without going down like the whole laundry list of what those acts are, you know, I see those as like a pneumatic nailer driving a nail into a 4x4 board exceptionally fast, and it's violent, and it completely changes everything, and it, you know,
in an instant.
And it's this extreme act of violence and trauma that somebody can experience, and you know, there are a variety of ways that happens. Or you can take that same nail and nail it in with like an 8-ounce hammer over 1,000 hits, and the result is somewhat the same. Like, the nail's still in the board, probably not with as much violence and, you know, other damage to surrounding things, but like it still is this low grade sustained trauma over the long time, like a long period of time, that has significant effects. So is it even fair for us to be calling that trauma?
So I want to take a step back and kind of define trauma.
Sure.
So there would be the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, which is how you diagnose people with various psychopathological mental health issues.
This is already a significantly smarter podcast than anything else we've done. So,
that's why you bring in experts.
That's it. Absolutely. Yes.
And that gives a very narrow, objective, and I put that in quotes, view of trauma. And basically, trauma is an experience that you're either witnessing or experiencing in your death experience, sexual violence. There's a couple of other parameters, but it's very, very specific.
Okay.
And one of the problems that a lot of practitioners see with the DSM definition is that it says if you have an experience outside of those parameters, it wasn't traumatic, period.
I see.
Which is very problematic.
Yeah.
Most people these days, in both in practice and in scholarship, are referring to trauma in more subjective terminology, where a traumatic event becomes traumatic when the person experiences it as trauma.
Sure.
So that could be...
So typically it would have been seen as the pneumatic drill. So like a moment that would qualify it as traumatic. And now it is more saying there's a highly contextual, because, well, as we know, right? Like what I experience as trauma might be entirely different from what you do. And to label the event as traumatic if nobody has experienced trauma because it hits a certain amount of boxes is flawed. Whereas the important thing is to say, like, no, that person was affected traumatically. Therefore, for that person. Okay.
Yeah. So, and you bring up a good point with the analogy. So for instance, someone could be crossing the street and a car is coming and turning, doesn't see them, slams on their brakes, doesn't hit them. And one person throws up their hands and is like, oh my goodness, I almost got hit by a car. Right. And another person has flashbacks about it for days that turn into weeks and months, and it becomes a PTSD like episode.
Doesn't like cars
doesn't
in general.
Go out at all. Yeah.
Wow.
We had an interesting like somewhat similar to that experience, like of a car accident. And so like I'm Connie's husband, for those of you who didn't make up the last name, like the connection here. But like we were in a car accident on the 401, and I would say, you know, without putting words into your mouth here, you and I experienced that very differently. I grew up in Montreal, where like getting almost hit by a car was an every Tuesday experience. We walking downtown, and it's like,
I was hit by a car today.
It's like, yeah. That's like every Tuesday afternoon.
You checked for your limbs and then got out of the car to help other people.
Right.
Basically.
And you know, and so our experiences of it were different. The way we tell the story is different. For sure, part of it is that you were driving and I wasn't, but that's really fascinating that like we're learning to realize that is it safe to say even like the way we tell the story backwards is telling of how we experienced it and also reinforcing of like the trauma or not?
So that's a part of the puzzle, but the other part is specifically what I'm studying. So the risk factors and promotive factors for resilience in the face of trauma. So let's say those same two people were walking across the street and the one had a really awful upbringing that they maybe experienced abuse in the home or witnessed domestic violence. Their parents were in and out of a relationship with one another. Ended up splitting. So there was a lack of consistency in the home with primary caregivers, which is a major risk factor for resilience or lack thereof. And maybe has had a significant car accident where a loved one died in a car accident in their past. So those would be risk factors going into that experience where they are experiencing that event, but with all those things in their subconscious.
All of those different lenses.
Yeah.
And
the other person has walked everywhere their whole life, never had a close incident with a car. They're used to being a pedestrian in a city, so they're looking out for cars naturally. Had a great upbringing, has a lot of promotive factors, protective factors for resilience in their life, so they experience that event differently.
Wow.
So we're going to get to talking about like some practical steps for building resilience, because it's not something that, and I think this is the like encouraging piece, is that, all of us are, on the other side of 30 sitting at this table. We won't tell you who is further along, but the good news is that, if we all had, varying degrees of resilience built into us and grown in us, and as we were kids and grew up, but it also doesn't end. Like it's not like well, if you didn't get it before 14,
made it through 30, and therefore I am set for
right. You can continue to build resilience. But before we get to that piece, I think that's where we're going to land. Do you see people acting in a way now that is indicative of experienced trauma in a way that maybe we're not fully aware of?
Absolutely. Over the past 2 years, I think any major schism in your normal everyday life, so the loss of a job, any sort of dynamic family changes, so a divorce, a family move, a death in the family.
Are you talking things that are typically seen as, for lack of a better word, like negative types of things? So not like the birth of a child.
So actually, that's a good point. So the birth of a child or a marriage would be significant factors for they're not necessarily risk factors for a lack of resilience, and they're certainly not traumatic events, but they are significant. Hopefully,
to be anyway.
They certainly can be.
They can be, absolutely,
birth,
right?
But
no doubt.
But I would say that those types of things can still cause enough of an upset or disruption to your everyday life that you should be on guard for emotional upset, generally speaking. But I'd say a large-scale event like a pandemic, it changed. Many people lost their jobs. So there's financial resources lacking, like across the board.
Right.
If you didn't lose your job, somebody who did. And that's speaking from a first world perspective.
Sure.
So I can only imagine what is happening in the 2/3 world right now.
No, exactly.
As a result of the pandemic. Pretty much all of us at least know somebody who's had COVID here. Many of us know someone who's died of COVID as well. Those are our large scale mass trauma experiences in the sense that we watched the news and we saw the numbers stack up and the recognition that those are people.
Yeah.
I remember 2 or 3 weeks into the pandemic, the first wave in Italy, it hit, I think it hit 1,000 people and like deaths.
Yeah.
And I broke down and cried.
Yeah.
And to look back on that experience now is shocking to me because we're talking millions across the globe and many who are uncounted. But at that time, it was like, oh, this is a big deal. Yeah. And those, each one of those people is a person. So that,
with a family, with relationships, with whatever. Yeah.
And it just, a sickness just kind of snuck up on people. But if you look at some of the things early on in the pandemic, like, I don't know if you bake sourdough bread.
We didn't do sourdough bread. We did other things though. Yeah, no, totally. Yeah,
he did sourdough bread.
I went fully down the rabbit hole.
Our office manager
sourdough.
did. She was all in on the sourdough. Yeah.
Fermentation station.
I had a whole fermentation station. I was making kombucha. I was making sourdough bread. I was making beer. Like it was.
All sorts of things.
It was wonderful. It smelled delicious.
Only one of them intentionally.
It smelled delicious.
Oh yeah, I bet that must have been.
It was awesome. It was like a whole kitchen table. Oh, it was so good.
Those are all normal coping mechanisms that people in the pandemic went through these odd viral phases online. So all these weird crazes that people went through, they were positive coping mechanisms early on in the pandemic, are indicative of a mass trauma or a mass change event.
Disruption or whatever. Yeah.
But even the negative coping mechanisms too, like panic buying. Like, and that can be tracked across history for the past 200 years or so.
Cool.
Things like that happen
it's always
in other
something.
Mass traumas. Yeah. So, and people tend to hoard. They want to take care of themselves. They want to take care of their families when things just go wrong. So
I remember there's a meat market near us on Upper Stony Creek, and like I was going there one day. This was before right on the brink of the first lockdown, and I don't know how many hundreds of dollars worth of meat and bacon. It was like, I am making 5,000 meatballs today. Like, this is what I'm doing. And enough bacon to feed us and breakfast sausages to protein my kids from now until the end of time. And I think it was gone in like a month. Like, it was like, we're good. But like, that's it, right? Is that it was, so you talk about like these traumatic events that happen or these significant impacts. And then you multiply that by whatever. Like, I don't think any of us experienced one at a time.
No.
Not for a long, long time, right? Like, it was the loss of, maybe it was the loss of your job, which then equals the loss of social releases, the loss of relationships, the loss of, an exercise outlet, the loss of XYZ, right? Like, so many things at the same time, which without any of the positive or many of the positive, coping factors that we normally rely on to mitigate those things. Huge.
Especially like the people you have in your life normally.
Yeah.
Who were, if you weren't bubbled with,
right.
you weren't seeing. Except
exactly.
on Zoom.
The bubble days. I remember those days.
It's okay. We're in the same bubble. I don't think we're doing bubbles anymore.
Not sure how that works. Yeah.
It's okay. Like, we're all in our own bubbles. And I was like, you just combined 8 bubbles. Like, do you understand how many? Like, do you know how that equation works? Like, I stink at math, but I think what you just did was open your family up to a multiple of like 1,000.
No, it was like, well, we're gonna bubble with you now, and then we're gonna bubble with you now.
That's right.
But it is interesting because that's like it is. You look on it now, and you're like, yeah, well, that was funny or whatever. But it in some way I think is a sign of like your brain just trying to catch up and trying to provide something for you. Like, you're trying to rationalize in some way, like, I know I need people around me, I know I need community, I know I need, and so you do these mental flip-flops because you know that it's important, and it's just you're trying to grab and hold on to something that you know is going to be healthy, even if it maybe contains within it some risk. And I remember that conversation, certainly like in our household. when we sent our kids back to daycare for the first time. It wasn't because COVID was over. No, it wasn't because there was no risk. It wasn't. It was just because we had reached kind of that threshold where we said it's now worth the risk of getting COVID based on everything we now know, because the social element for the kids was so beneficial.
Right.
And the mental health element.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Tremendously so. I mean, I think of how busy I was in ministry. Like, our response as a church was like, well, at least I'm not even going to blame the church. My response was like, all right, on this day, I'm doing this online thing. And then the next day, this. And then I'm going to pre-record this so that that's available on this day. And that was every week, like every week. And it was just this, that was my sourdough, was like, I'm apparently becoming an online TV personality, like like a YouTube personality. I remember researching that stuff. Be like, do I need to learn about this stuff? Very quickly, I learned there's not much you can learn about these things, sort of like, unless you're willing to light things on fire or run over stuff with a truck.
No, it's true. I remember when you were doing, like, at one point you had like a art with Alex, or art with Pastor Alex,
art time with Mr. Alex. Yeah.
And actually, like Anna did that a couple times, and
it was fun.
We were all just trying to figure out what to do. And I think that at least for me has been a helpful narrative. And I do want to talk about some coping mechanisms in a minute. It's been a helpful narrative just to look back on it and realize that at every turn we were trying to do the best we could. And, I think that the stories we tell ourselves are very powerful. And so obviously, like, that there's good and bad there, because if you're telling yourself an accurate story, that's one thing. If you're telling yourself an inaccurate story, that's another thing. Yeah. But there, I think, is a goodness in looking back and going, like at every turn, you were trying to faithfully respond to what was in front of you and take a step. Well, what's a step? You started art time with Mr. Alex. What's a faithful step? You started pre-recording services. What's a faithful step? You started doing these things. Yeah. And, eventually we all got exhausted and, stopped stuff and started other stuff, and up and down energy and all of those things. I guess the last question that I want to ask before we turn to specifically looking at coping mechanisms is something that, to tie it all the way back to the opening illustration, is that I see these heightened responses. And I don't think it would be right to say that's always indicative of trauma. No. But is it safe to say that it's always indicative of something related to your mental health? That, like, if something makes you angry, it might very well deserve, like, you may very well need to be angry. But if you're responding to everything at a 10, then there's probably some underlying thing going on. If you cry, like, at the drop of a hat, again, tears are great and good, helpful, important, holy things. Yeah. But if it's almost to that, like, uncontrollable place, it's probably talking about something under the surface. Are you seeing those types of responses in people that you interact with in everyday life? Remembering that I'm sitting right here and living in the same household, like.
Tell.
Yeah. But it's the crying one, isn't it?
Anna, would you come in here, please?
But like, I do know that, like, through seasons of the pandemic, in full transparency, like, I have had a shorter temper. I know with patience with my kids, I have been less patient than I would have wanted to be. And so I look back on that and I go, like, I know I was exhausted. I know I was burning the candle at both ends. I was trying to do too much. I know all of those things, and that's not to make excuses, because my actions were still wrong. But I think before the reason why I want to talk a little bit about this is that before we turn to building resilience, I think we have to have an accurate assessment on where we are. And that's something that I see our society as a whole struggle with. Like, our sort of cultural moment isn't very self-aware. Even to
accurate
locate
in evaluating. Right. Like, it's always what's next. What can we look forward to? This was right out of our AGM, like our annual report. My letter was to say, like, do you find people always want to ask what's next way more than how did we do or what was that like. We don't want to go there. Is that accurate for the large part?
I definitely would agree with that. Henry Nouwen actually, I think in the 70s or 80s, a while ago, wrote a piece, I don't remember which book it's in, but on being preoccupied and the human's orientation toward the future and preoccupation or worry about the future and anxiety about the future, an inability to sit in the here and now and assess what's actually happening.
Wow.
Or be spiritual for that matter. If you're always occupied with some future time, some future productivity or event,
right?
There's a spiritual lack happening as well.
Yeah, I know personally the people that I admire as spiritual role models for myself, for my kids, for Catherine and I as a couple, are the folks that are able to experience God in the present. Like I think a lot of us tend to rely on seeing God in the rearview mirror of going like, you know what, in hindsight, I can really see how God was working there, which is good. It's a really important thing for us to do. Again, those that I really lean into and trust and hold up as the examples that I want to emulate and turn to for answers are those that are able to go in the moment. This is where I see God working. And it's not flawless, but I mean, like it's that intentionality to say what's happening right now instead of that longing for what's next, which is always unknown, right? Like apart from Jesus coming back, everything else is right? Like really, our plans in the next 5 minutes could be entirely moot because it's the future. We don't know, right? Like reasonable probability, but anyway.
Well, if the pandemic taught us anything, it's we don't know what's going to happen next. No. And I think that's what was so blindsiding for so many is that we feel like we're in control of our own lives, and the pandemic has shown us that is not the case at all.
Yeah. I mean, we've shared before, I think the three of us have chatted before, even with our families when we get together, that like, if you think back to 2 years ago, this is when we were getting some good news from John Krasinski. We were getting videos of people, banging pots and pans in support of first responders and that kind of stuff. And I feel like 3 months was about the max we as a world were ready to give to that. That was like, so that's about my bandwidth of supporting through this.
Yeah.
And then is there a degree of like, what is the statute of limitations on that stuff? Is there a degree of denial that kicks in at a certain point? Like, is that the
that's
identifiers?
Actually clinical.
Okay. Right
like on. Pandemic fatigue is
well done.
No books.
Pandemic fatigue is actually a thing and can be shown throughout other pandemics, not just this one. And people do have a limitation, and then they tend to either overreact or underreact. And you can see that in in the news for the past 2 years minus 3 months.
Any extreme examples of stuff that's happened in Canada or on the world stage. Like, I think things are just really well managed. I think as a whole, like,
I mean, you brought up the Will Smith, Chris Rock event. That's an individual overreaction as a result of something pent up inside, whether that's pandemic related or family related.
Right.
We'll never know.
Who knows?
But
you
see things on a macro scale, though, like Russia invading Ukraine. Like there was tension there before the pandemic, but I'm not saying the pandemic caused that or anything. Like I think fully believe in justice and
absolutely.
But the pandemic exacerbated existing problems.
Didn't help it.
Yeah.
Well, again, like in Canada, like, I mean, the divide between, well, not just Canada, I think in the US as well, the divide between kind of quote unquote liberal and conservative has always been there.
Yeah.
But I think especially in Canada, where it's not, we haven't tended to camp ourselves in the far extremes as much. There's sort of that gentle understanding of like, there's a few degrees of difference, but for the most part, you can be a centrist. That's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
That became the worst thing right now. Like, if you're not either entirely against this or entirely for this, like, what are you? And I think again, I don't think anybody could have fathomed in 2 years ago that we would be having nationwide shutdowns, nationwide movements to descend on Ottawa and voice our displeasure. Like it's just not typically Canadian. And I guess is a key piece to this, like that's not typical. Like is that like something
not
that we're
typical behavior?
Yeah. Like, is that something that we're to be looking, like you mentioned, like if you're hitting 10 out of 10 on everything. So is that
so? I mean, there are different ways to conceive of that, like whether you look at it from a philosophical standpoint,
sure,
like Gerard and the scapegoat, we blame it on the pandemic, or
right,
or whether you look at it from a psychological standpoint, and it's a traumatic event that we are responding to internally, and it's coming out externally.
So if we were to turn now to like a little bit of a conversation on landing practically, because I think I hear we're all talking about it. We've all seen it. I think we've all felt it and experienced it. Like none of us are operating at our best. And so like,
if you think you are, you're part of the problem.
Maybe take a minute. So there's definitely something to be said about, maybe some practical, like how do you learn to be present? And like, what would be your best advice to someone who's like, okay, I've blown up a couple times at my family, or, I walked out of a meeting at work because it did not go the way I thought it was going to go, or I yelled at somebody on the subway because they took my seat or hit me with their bag, like something. If somebody is out there thinking, how can I be present? How can I slow down? What would be like one or two practices for them to do that? And then I guess the larger conversation is, are there practices that we can begin that could start to rebuild or build resilience in us, like as individuals, as families? But I think the reality that we need to come to is like, this isn't over yet. Right. And not only is it not over yet, but someday we will deem it over-ish. And even at that point, there's still going to be this recovery period. Yeah. What would be some of those things?
First of all, I'd say don't beat yourself up about all the things that you've done wrong over the past 2 years, because if you're self-aware at all, there's going to be a list.
Of which I have a list for you, Grant. Beginning with.
So, Alex, before we started recording this podcast.
But practicing self-compassion is sometimes much more difficult than practicing compassion for someone else.
Sure.
So if you can put yourself in the shoes of your spouse or your best friend or a parent, any loving relationship that of somebody who cares about you, what would that person say to you in those events? That's a good starter for how you think through and word frame self-compassion. What is more productive is to think about giving yourself some margins in your life so that you're not always operating. I'd say most of us have been operating well beyond our margins. We're off the page, and that's why people are going off the rails. So during the pandemic, we need to really focus on what are the things in your life that you want to focus on, and what are unnecessary things. And this is something I really struggle with, as Grant is well aware. I tend to take on too much and then have to pare back rather than not taking on as much in the first place. And that's a coping mechanism for trying to figure out challenging times like the pandemic. But I think if there's one or two things in your life that you don't need to be focusing on now, cross them off your list. I think that's a good starting point. You have to make space and time for Sabbath, for rest, for any kind of rejuvenating practice. And as much as I like to sit down with a glass of wine and some popcorn and binge watch Netflix, it's not rejuvenating.
Sure. Yeah.
Some days it's all I can do at the end of the day, but it's not rejuvenating. So what actually gives your soul life? What feeds you? So maybe that's turning off the TV and having a serious conversation with your spouse, just a pleasant conversation. I don't know how your family operated during the pandemic, but so many families were just
barely
bare.
Barely is a good word.
Define operated.
Did you and Catherine see each other during the pandemic?
Well, no, I think that resonates so much with me in terms of and I think especially what I wrestle with especially is that I need to be all things that all people expect. So I need to be able to play roughhouse with Tommy when he needs me to. I need to be prepared to do art time with Sarah when she needs it. I need to be prepared, not even just prepared. I need to make space for reading for 45 minutes with Becca. And I need to be prepared for, making something with Emily in the kitchen for this amount of time. And then I have to have that space for Catherine. And then I have to have this space to read. And I have to have this space for this. And I was sharing with Grant, this is full on Alex confession mode here right now. It has been months since I've gone to bed 2 nights in a row before 2 a.m. Easily.
Wow.
And that is it's eating me up.
That's a problem.
Yeah.
I mean, Catherine, for years we've had this joke about me being a sleep camel that I can hang on with so little sleep for so long, but we're going 2 stinking years of trying to run at that level, and it ain't healthy, friends. And so that having that permission to say you need to evaluate what can stay and go today, and that will be different from tomorrow, right? And the next week and the next season of life, and that right. The ministry year is filled with, Easter comes, you don't get to skip Easter, but you know what you can skip? A service every day of the week. Right? Which a lot of churches struggle with, or feeling like you need to do the if it's just your family at home celebrating this year, you do not have to do the 12-course meal, right? You don't. And this is the stuff we put on ourselves. You know what I need to do? I need to go out and find out how grandma made that cake so that I can do that for my family so they're not missing out on that. It's a pandemic, friends. You're going to miss out on stuff.
Yeah.
And that's okay. It sucks. But it's okay that these things are that if we pretend that disruption isn't real,
right.
You're going to be worse off.
Yeah.
And
I think so. You said a couple of things that I want to touch on that I think are really important, but and a third is I think that a lot of us for the first stages of the pandemic ran around trying to make sure that everything felt the same, that nothing felt different, right? And so we've talked a little bit about this, but the when we canceled services, in our congregation, it was on the Friday or Saturday. I think it was Saturday where we finally made the decision to.
Yep.
And I was convinced. I was like, no matter what, I'm gonna make sure that there's a service up on YouTube on Sunday. And I think I was up until about 4 on Saturday night getting stuff ready. And my musicians were great and volunteers came together. We filmed everything. But then I was left with all of the stuff filmed. And then I was like, well, okay, now what? How do you post a video to YouTube?
Right.
And so
time to learn.
Right.
This
so
is the
we had to do
learn.
all of that. And I'm not saying that to whatever, pat myself on the back, because I think we've all done this in various places.
Sure.
It was in an attempt to mitigate the disruption or even try to eliminate it. And then we all reached a point where we're like, oh, this hole is so big. And I'm sitting here with a spoon, just trying to fill it up or empty it out or whatever, however you want to picture that thing. And it's
what are you doing with that wall, Grant? Just rebuilding it with sugar cubes, Alex.
Yeah.
You know it's raining, right, Grant? Don't worry, I got it.
It's all good. It's all good. It's fine. It's fine. I'm fine.
I got it.
I'm okay. But it was. I think that's worth noting. We all ran around trying to eliminate the upheaval. And what you just said, I think, is very important. You are going to miss out. Once you realize that, then it becomes way easier to give yourself the permission to say no to things proactively.
Sure.
Because now you've come to the realization, oh, I'm going to miss out on something. Maybe I could actually choose what I miss out on and what I participate in, which is not something that many of us learn in
Right.
life is how to say no so that we can say yes to the things we really want to say yes to. So, okay, so we're talking about being like giving yourself extra grace. That's where we started in terms of practical ways to build resilience and at least remind yourself that like things are okay. Take like, you know, for sure, give yourself extra grace. For sure, spend some time, you know, actually just even feeling your feelings and emotions and like assessing where you're at. And if you, you know, if you even have if you have the bandwidth, but, you know, have a conversation about that with somebody else. We're talking about learning to say no and actually proactively like prioritizing what you will and won't do. I do think that's something that we've had to learn and are learning in this season. And it's a very practical way to, I think, to mitigate a lot of what we're talking about. What are some other really practical ways in terms of building resilience? And I almost want to say like something that somebody could go out in 20 minutes from now and start doing, or even just start planning to do, because that's another thing, like, you know, is planning to do something is actually really beneficial.
Yes.
So give us something that somebody could turn this video off and go out and start.
So I think one of the helpful things to cope right now would be creating a new routine with you, with your partner, with your family, whoever you live with. Just some everyday practices that you do every day. If that can incorporate something spiritual into it, which is a protective factor for resilience, better yet. But don't make it above and beyond. Like we're so used to doing things above and beyond, and I'm going to read the whole Bible in a year. No. Read the whole Psalms this year.
No, you're not.
Like,
right. Yeah.
Like, don't start with the A+ assignment, especially in the pandemic, especially when we're already living beyond our margins. Start with something very small. But routines and rituals help us make meaning in the midst of the madness of everything that's happening. So especially with kids or families, it's really important to have practices. And they don't even have to be like practices that would be generally helpful. So I have a friend who, for a while during the pandemic, to help cope, said that Frozen, the movie, was the movie that they watched when Daddy went to work every day. And that was their routine or ritual. An hour and a half of Frozen every morning, which, as much as I love Anna and Elsa, that's a lot of Frozen.
A lot of Frozen.
Yep.
That's a lot of warm hugs.
And you wouldn't normally be okay with that as a parent. But if that is helping your kid find routine and find meaning and make sense of what is going on in this craziness, I would say that's an okay thing.
Yeah.
And it's,
that's cool.
One of the routines we have started is, well, we have a few that we would not normally do, but I have a night class. So Grant pulls our giant dining room table into the family room.
That's awesome.
And they sit at it and have family movie night with Daddy. Daddy and daughters movie night while Mommy's in class. And it's a simple, kind of silly coping mechanism.
And it's completely impractical. Except for the fact that it's fun and exceptionally beneficial.
Yeah. And the girls love it. They look forward to it.
Yeah.
Routines give us those things to look forward to when things are kind of out of control.
Such a beautiful, like, gospel thing that you've just described of like this. I mean, it's what the gospel is in our lives. Like, it's this thing that is decidedly inconvenient and yet of infinite benefit. Right? Like, and that's a beautiful way of framing that. That's not me. That's you. You framed it. Boy, I worded that really well. No, but that, like, really, like, it is recognizing these things. Even this season, right? Like, I feel like we're hitting this point where people are saying, like, you know, it's not, well, you know, it was never that bad. No, it was. Like, we did have moments. We were reduced to tears when we heard of people that we knew about or places that we'd been that had been just so affected. And this was decidedly inconvenient. And how we respond can be infinitely beneficial, right? Like, wow.
Yeah.
And that is Grant's love language, is doing the ridiculously inconvenient, but an act of love for all.
That's your love language, being inconvenient.
The look on your face leading up to that was like,
where are we going here?
What's my love language?
Ridiculously.
Do tell.
Ridiculously inconvenient.
At one point in the pandemic, he bought a strobe light for a Zoom dance party for Anna to have with her cousins.
Yeah. Two strobe lights.
Because everyone needs two strobe lights.
I'm not saying I bought similar things.
I was looking for like a funfair, like confetti cannon, but
of course you were.
Those were sold out.
Early on, we bought a lot of Hot Wheels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like a lot of Hot Wheels. There's more track in our house than I would care to admit.
Yeah.
But it was like, this is going to be a thing that we do.
Yep. This is our thing. So, and also why many people started baking sourdough and doing those things, because it was like there was the routine of it. It was something practical. So, so build a routine, build a new routine, but don't go overboard. Don't, and continue to not beat yourself up when you fail and break your routine. That's one. Give us a couple others.
So I'd say start exposing yourself to the outside world, and do it in small doses. But one of the things that I think fairly collectively, I'm an introvert myself. I really don't like large crowds, but I missed being around people. I missed worshiping in community. Yeah. And that's a psychological loss that we'll never get back. But to return to it can have very healing benefits. And even the in many other countries, it's still the norm to live multi-generationally,
right,
with relatives. And here, it's very individualistic, your nuclear family. But when you're only allowed to be with your household, that becomes very isolating for childcare, for someone to talk to during the day that's another adult if you're home alone with the kids. And I think that sense of community is something we missed out on in big ways. So get yourself back in community, whether that is going to church on Sunday or attending a small group or going for a walk with one other person because you'd prefer to be outdoors and keep your masks on. Like take small steps and don't do something that you're completely uncomfortable with. But I'd say take those small steps back toward community, whatever that looks like.
Which is just that's not you saying that those things are unreasonable or were unnecessary.
Not
right?
At all.
Like that these, and I think that's important for folks to hear. And I know we all need those reminders too, is that like, just because this is something that we need to get back to doesn't mean that it was wrong to engage in. And I think that again is our kind of extreme response to things, that it's like, we never should have done this in the first place. Millions of lives have been saved by these decisions, and you may still have completely valid reasons, right? Like if you have immunocompromised parents, maybe the suggestion to go and be with your family is not the suggestion for you right now, right? Because that reality is still very present.
But maybe you could drive by their house and wave.
Yeah. Have a front lawn visit or something. Yeah.
Seeing people in person, even if it is not speaking to them, there is something innate to that, I believe.
For sure. Yeah. For sure.
And just for the record, like I was housebound for the first 2 months of the pandemic. I did not leave our property. So
right, because you were pregnant still, right?
Yeah, I was pregnant and I'm immunocompromised. So,
yeah. No doubt, man.
So it was like we've been very careful, but it's from that place that I know like I need to get back out there, and we're still being careful, and we're triple vaxxed, and we still wear masks even when they're not required. But starting to see people is so life-giving because
it is.
Life was meant to be lived with one another, not in bubbles.
Sure.
Last practice. Do you have like a last final thing for us?
I would say have fun. We've been so used to surviving for the past couple of years. So it is important to celebrate. And we've missed out on so many celebrations, corporately especially. I just think of the Easters that we've missed out on together, the Christmases. We had the most ridiculous Christmas celebration just before the pandemic, and then we didn't get to see people the following Christmas. So it was ridiculous in a good way.
Yeah.
So everybody piled into one house, and
it was chaotic and hilarious and fun.
Like that's what, exactly.
So take those times to celebrate with your loved ones and do something fun, do something ridiculous. It doesn't have to cost money. It doesn't have to put you out of your comfort zone, but smile again. I think there's something to that.
Sure.
Yeah. Like I think sometimes we get into situations or scenarios where maybe we don't allow ourselves to have fun because it doesn't feel like the right response to any given moment. And like that I think that's just a good word of encouragement to say, hey, to say allow yourself to have fun.
Yeah.
And allow yourself to begin to experience those things again, because they are going to be healing. And it's not just about, you having fun, whatever, while everything else is falling apart. It's about learning again to live and to re-engage and
I'd be careful to don't have fun if you're not feeling it. Like allow yourself to feel the negative emotions too, but after you've allowed those, after you've started to process those, then learn to celebrate. And I'd make a distinction between celebration and just like meaningless fun.
Yeah.
There's something holistic about it. More life-giving. So
Connie will do a session on that later when Grant and I aren't here. No, it's very true. And again, I think it's a huge piece to this is the stuff that we don't even know we've lost, right? Like it's I live with 4 kids. And so our days are plenty silly, right? Like, and some of that is part of what I add to it as their dad, shockingly. But it's easy to forget that for some people, they haven't been around a child for 2 years. They haven't heard a kid laugh. They haven't heard a kid find something totally ridiculous, silly and funny and have that kind of, and friends, like this is part of how God made the world is for us to experience those things because like, again, you don't have to be the source of everything that you get in life. You can't be. And so like, opening ourselves up to those possibilities again.
So I want to say thanks to Connie for joining us.
Absolutely.
Hopefully this was as fun for you as it was for us. I don't think
that's a loaded question.
I don't think you and I laugh more during the week than we do during this podcast. But we hope that it actually gives you a couple practical things. I think the last thing that I would say is if you have been taking notes and writing down all of the practical tips that Connie's given us, maybe don't go out and try to do them all at once. Again, just take the next faithful step, right? What is the next step for you? What is a first step? And then go from there. But thanks for joining us. And we hope that this encouraged you today.